Hello students, today we will start a new chapter of civics, that is confronting marginalization. In this chapter we will study the topics invoking fundamental rights, laws for the marginalized, the SC and ST Act 1989, manual scavenging, Adivasi demands and the 1989 Act. So in the previous chapter we read about two different groups, that is the Adivasis and the minority group, that is the Muslims, and their experiences of inequality and discrimination. Though powerless, such groups have fought, protested and struggled against being excluded or dominated by others. And marginalization, as we studied in the previous chapter, is the social process of being confined to a lower social standing. It involves people being denied their fundamental rights, which results in lowering their economic and social status. In the social environment, groups of people or communities may have the experience of being excluded. In this chapter, we will read about some of the ways in which groups and individuals challenge existing inequalities. Adivasis, Dalits, Muslims, women and other marginal groups argue that simply by being citizens of a democratic country, they possess equal rights that must be respected. Many among them look up to the Constitution to address their concerns. In this chapter, we will see why the Constitution of India is something that marginalized groups invoke in the course of their struggles. The first topic is invoking fundamental rights. The Constitution, as we have learnt in the first chapter of this book, lays down the principles that make our society and polity democratic. They are defined in and through the list of fundamental rights that are an important part of the Constitution of India. These rights are available to all Indians equally. As far as the marginalized are concerned, they have drawn on these rights in two ways. First, by insisting on their fundamental rights, they have forced the government to recognize the injustice done to them. Secondly, they have insisted that the government enforce these laws, and in some instances the struggles of the marginalized have influenced the government to frame new laws in keeping with the spirit of the fundamental rights. Article 17 of the Constitution states that untouchability has been abolished. And its practice in any form is forbidden. The enforcement of any disability arising out of untouchability shall be an offence punishable in accordance with the law. What this means is that no one can henceforth prevent Dalits from educating themselves, entering temples, using public facilities like parks, shopping malls, etc. It also means that it is wrong to practice untouchability and that this practice will not be tolerated by a democratic government. In fact, untouchability is a punishable crime now. Untouchability is a social curse, but this practice existed and it still is existing to some extent in the Hindu social class or caste that was considered by other classes to be the lowest, and the untouchables were considered to be the lowest in the ladder of the caste system. And these untouchables were a section of people who were placed at the lowest level of the caste hierarchy, and they were supposed to serve the upper three castes, that is the Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. And these groups at the bottom level of the caste ladder were called untouchables or Dalits. They were seen as unworthy and were excluded by other caste people. They could not even use the public facilities. They were not allowed to enter the homes of the upper caste or even enter temples. So this Article 17 of the Constitution. According to this, the practice of untouchability has been abolished. Then there are other sections in the Constitution that help to strengthen the government argument against untouchability. For example, Article 15 of the Constitution notes that no citizen of India shall be discriminated against on the basis of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth, and it applies to all the states. And 15(2), that is part 2 here, prohibits discrimination at public places, that is shops, public hotels, restaurants, wells, tanks, bathing huts, etc., and it applies both to the states and the individuals. So nobody can discriminate anyone on the basis of their religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. So now the Dalits can invoke or draw on a fundamental right or rights in situations where they feel that they have been treated badly by some individual or community or even by the government. They have drawn the attention of the Government of India to the Constitution, demanding that the government abide by it and do justice to them. And similarly, other minority groups have drawn on the fundamental rights section of our Constitution. They have particularly drawn upon the right to freedom of religion and cultural and educational rights. In the case of cultural and educational rights, distinct cultural and religious groups like the Muslims and Parsis have the right to be the guardian of the content of their culture, as well as the right to make decisions on how best this content is to be preserved. Thus, by granting different forms of cultural rights, the Constitution tries to ensure cultural justice to such groups, and so that the culture of these groups is not dominated nor wiped out by the culture of the majority community. So we see that the Constitution has given certain rights to these minority groups to protect their religion, culture, language, script, so that the minority groups also enjoy equal rights in the society. Now the next topic is laws for the marginalized. So as we already know that the government makes laws to protect its citizens, yet this is not the only way in which it takes actions. There are specific laws and policies for the marginalized in our country. There are policies or schemes that emerge through other means like setting up a committee or by undertaking a survey, which means that the government sets up committees, like we studied about the Sachar committee in the previous chapter, which studies about the problems of the minority group and then suggests the government to take certain steps to bring or give justice to these minority groups or the tribals. The government then makes an effort to promote such policies in order to give opportunities to specific groups. And how this is done? By promoting social justice. As part of their effort to implement the Constitution, both state and central governments create specific schemes for implementation in tribal areas or in areas that have a high Dalit population. For example, the government provides for free or subsidized hostels for students of Dalit and Adivasi communities so that they can avail of education facilities that may not be available in their localities. The government, in addition to providing certain facilities like free or subsidized hostels for students of Dalit and Adivasi communities, the government also operates through laws to ensure that concrete steps are taken to end inequality in the system. One such law or policy is the reservation policy that today is both significant and highly contentious. This is the law that reserves seats in education and government employment for Dalits and Adivasis, and are based on an important argument that in a society like ours, where for centuries sections of the population have been denied opportunities to learn and to work in order to develop new skills or vocations, a democratic government needs to step in and assist these sections. And now, how does the reservation policy work? The government across India have their own list of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and backward and most backward castes. The central government also has its own list. Students applying to educational institutions and those applying for posts in government are expected to furnish proof of their caste or tribe status in the form of caste and tribe certificates. And if a particular Dalit caste or a certain tribe is on the government list, then a candidate from the caste or tribe can avail of the benefit of reservation for admission to colleges, especially to institutes of professional education such as medical college. Governments define as a set of cut-off marks. This means that not all Dalit and tribal candidates can qualify for admission, but only those who have done reasonably well and secured marks above the cut-off point will get admission. And the government also offers special scholarships for these students. So these are the facilities or reservation policies of the government to promote social justice to Dalits, Adivasis, or the minority groups. Then coming to the next topic, protecting the rights of Dalits and Adivasis. In addition to policies, our country also has specific laws that guard against the discrimination and exploitation of the marginalized communities. So there's a story here about the village of Jakmaglur, where the people or the villagers are gearing up for a big festival which is held once in 5 years, and the local deity is honored, and priests from 20 neighboring villages have come in for this 5-day event. The ceremony begins with a member of the Dalit community washing the feet of all the priests and then bathing in the water used for this. So in Jakmalgur, the person who performed this task belonged to Ratnam's family, and now his father and grandfather, they both had performed the same task before him. Though they were never allowed to enter the temple, this ritual was viewed as a great honor bestowed on them on this special occasion. Now it was Ratnam's turn, and Ratnam, who is a 20-year-old boy studying engineering in a nearby college, he refused to perform this ritual, even though he belongs to the Dalit community. And then he says that why should I perform this age-old practice of washing the feet of the priests and bathing in that water. So he is an educated young man of India, and he is not willing to perform the ritual. He said that he had no faith in this practice and that his family members were forced to perform this ritual because they were Dalits. Ratnam's refusal has angered both the powerful caste in the village and some families from his own community. The powerful castes were shocked that such a young boy had the guts to refuse them. They believed that it was Ratnam's education which allowed him to imagine that he could start comparing himself with them. So all this was blamed upon the education system, which had given such knowledge to Ratnam that all the Indians enjoy equal rights in this country, and even though he belonged to a Dalit community, he was, or he can never be forced to perform such a degrading ritual. Those from Ratnam's own caste were fearful of angering the powerful. Many worked on their fields as daily wage laborers, and if the dominant caste decided not to call them, then from where would they earn their livelihood? How will they survive? So his own caste members did not support him because they feared the rage of the upper caste people. They also declared that the wrath of the local deity would strike them if they refused to give in. Ratnam argued that given that not a single Dalit had ever entered the temple, how could the deity be angry with him? So he says that we have never been allowed to enter the temple, so how can the god be angry with my decision of not washing the feet of the priest? The powerful caste decided to teach Ratnam a lesson. His community was ordered to ostracize him and his family. So ostracize means to exclude from the group or banish from the group. So his community was ordered to ostracize him and his family, and everyone was told that no one should speak or do any work for them or with them. And one night some men even entered the part of the village and set his hut on fire. He managed to escape with his mother. Ratnam then went to file a case in the local police station under the ST-SC Act of 1989. And other Dalit families still did not come out with him to support him. They were scared that a similar fate might await them, and if they spoke about it. So this was the terror of the upper caste in this village of Jakmalgur. The case was picked up by the local media that led to many journalists visiting the village. Ratnam was written out as a symbol of Dalit action, and the ritual was called off, but his family was forced to move out as they continued to be ostracized by the powerful caste in the village. Even though he was banished from the village and from his own community, still Ratnam refused to give in to the wishes of the upper caste. Now we'll study about the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Act of 1989, or the Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989. This act was framed in 1989 in response to demands made by Dalits and others that the government must take seriously the ill treatment and humiliation Dalit and tribal groups face in an everyday sense. While such treatment had persisted for a long time, it had acquired a violent character in the late 1970s and 1980s. During this period, in parts of the southern India, a number of assertive Dalit groups came into being and asserted their rights. They refused to perform their so-called caste duties and insisted on being treated equally. Like Ratnam, they refused to follow practices located in humiliation and exploitation of the Dalits. This resulted in the more powerful caste unleashing violence against them, and in order to indicate to the government that untouchability was still being practiced and in the most hideous manner, Dalit groups demanded new laws that would list the various sorts of violence against Dalits and prescribe stringent punishment for those who indulge in them. So it was brought to the notice of the government to make certain new laws to protect the Dalits from the anger or the violence directed towards them by the upper caste or the majority groups. So this act does not only describe terrible crimes but also lets people know that dreadful deeds human beings are capable of. So firstly, it lists modes of humiliation that are both physically horrific and morally reprehensible, and seeks to punish those who force a member of the scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe to drink or eat any inedible or obnoxious substance. Obnoxious means extremely unpleasant. Or it seeks to punish those people who forcibly removes clothes from the person of a member of a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe, or parades him or her naked or with painted face or body, or commits any similar act which is derogatory to human dignity. So in this sense, laws such as these seek to both punish as well as influence the way we think and act. And this act sets out to punish anyone who wrongfully occupies or cultivates any land owned by or allotted to a member of the scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe, or gets the land allotted to him transferred. So nobody can now wrongfully occupy or cultivate any land owned by a member of the scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe, or gets the land allotted to him. So if this is with the case, it is again transferred back to the original owner of the land. At another level, the act recognizes that the crimes against Dalits and tribal women are of a specific kind, and therefore seeks to penalize anyone who assaults or uses force on any women belonging to a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe with intent to dishonor her. So these are very, very strict laws. So this Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989, it defines various types of atrocities against the STs, SCs. Under Section 3, provides for stringent punishments, enhanced punishments for public servants, punishment for neglect of duty by a public servant, attachment and forfeiture of property, creation of special courts to try the offences under this act. So these are certain provisions of the Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989. And the objective of the act, therefore, very clearly emphasizes the intention of the Indian state to deliver justice to SCs and ST communities through affirmative action in order to enable them to live in society with dignity and self-esteem and without fear, violence or suppression from the dominant caste. So all these provisions in this act is to allow the ST, SC communities to live without fear, violence or suppression from the dominant caste. The Supreme Court of India too reiterated the significance and importance of this act. Now coming to the topic of manual scavenging. So we need to understand what is manual scavenging. Manual scavenging refers to the practice of removing human and animal waste or excreta using brooms, tin plates and baskets from dry latrines and carrying it on the head to disposal grounds some distance away. This was a practice in India which had happened for a very, very long time. and a manual scavenger is the person who does this job of carrying this filth. This practice has been taking place in our society for centuries, but this practice was really shameful and an offense against human dignity. That is why many social reformers and activists of the human rights severely condemned this practice. As a result, the government passed a law against manual scavenging in 1993. The Employment of Manual Scavengers and Construction of Dry Latrines Act 1993 prevents the use of dry latrines. It aimed to regulate the construction and maintenance of water-sealed latrines. The Act has provisions to punish for the employment of scavengers or the construction of dry latrines with imprisonment for up to 1 year. The offenders are also liable to prosecution under the STSC Act of 1989. So there are such strict laws preventing this practice of manual scavenging. The court has observed that the number of manual scavengers in India has increased since 1993 law. It directed every department, ministry of the union government and state government to verify the facts within 6 months, and if manual scavenging was found to exist, then the government department has to actively take up a time-bound program for their liberation and rehabilitation. So the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act came into force on 6th December 2013. So you need to underline and remember these dates. And there are questions like, what do you understand by manual scavenging, or who are manual scavengers? So the answer here is given on this page number 101. Now coming to the last topic, Adivasi demands and the 1989 Act. The central government passed the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006, that is the recognition of forest rights. This act recognizes their rights to homestead, cultivable and grazing land, and to non-timber forest produce. The Act also points out that the rights of forest dwellers includes conservation of forests and biodiversity. Adivasi demands and the 1989 Act. The 1989 Act is important for another reason. Adivasi activists refer to it to defend their right to occupy land that was traditionally theirs. And as we have read in the previous chapter, Adivasis are often unwilling to move from their land and are forcibly displaced. Activists have asked that those who have forcibly encroached upon the tribal lands should be punished under this law. They have also pointed to the fact that this act merely confirms what has already been promised to tribal people in the Constitution, that land belonging to tribal people cannot be sold or bought by non-tribal people. In cases where this has happened, the Constitution guarantees the right of tribal people to repossess their land, meaning that if a tribal land has been bought by a non-tribal, according to the Constitution, it has to be returned back to the original owners of the land. According to C.K. Janu, she's an Adivasi activist. She has pointed out that one of the violators of constitutional rights guaranteed to tribal people are governments in the various states of India, for it is they who allow non-tribal encroachers in the form of timber merchants, paper mills, etc. to exploit tribal land and to forcibly evict tribal people from their traditional forest in the process of declaring forests as reserved or sanctuaries. She also noted that in cases where tribals have already been evicted and cannot go back to their lands, they must be compensated. That is, the government must draw up plans and policies for them to live and work elsewhere. And after all, the government spends large sums of money on building industrial or other projects on lands taken from the tribals. So why should they be reluctant to spend some amount for rehabilitating these displaced tribals? So we see that existence of a right or a law or even a policy on paper does not mean that it exists and in reality. People have had to constantly work on or make efforts to translate these into principles that guide the actions of their fellow citizens or even their leaders. The desire for equality, dignity, and respect is not new. It has existed in different forms throughout our history, and even in a democratic society, similar process of struggle, writing, negotiation, and organizing, it still needs to continue. And it is the duty of every educated Indian to fight for the rights of other fellow Indian citizens. Then only we can have a very just society or an equal society, and then only we can give justice to everyone, and the basis of our constitution, where everybody is equal before law, will be fulfilled. So with this we come to the end of the chapter, and please read the chapter twice. You'll find all the answers and answer these questions. Explain Article 17 of the Constitution. Then, why did the government make specific laws and policies for the marginalized in our country? Why was the 1989 Act framed by the government? What should the government do for the displaced tribals? So if you read the chapter, you will find all the answers. Thank you, children.